It's like the standards in this case are best understood as aspirational. And like a strict diet or a prudent plan to save money, they represent good intentions not often realized. So again, you sold out Massachusetts for what? This isn't going to help your kids. But that's the catch, isn't it? How many American moms and dads hear the word standards and think this must be a good thing? Or assume there weren't any before? Or assume that somehow a federal government who can manage almost nothing well is somehow going to take over education and that did well? I mean, what evidence do you have that they can do it? Name one thing you think they've really done a good job managing. I can't, and I'll walk back to Wisconsin. If you can tell me the last time the federal government took something over, failed it, and then gave it back to the people. They don't. That's the big deal here. Okay, so we're downhill now. Maybe another half hour, a little bit more, we'll be done. I want to spend some time on the standards. Before I do, I have to underscore this for you. Even if you think you like the standards, even if you think Common Core is a great idea, how in the world do we allow it to stand the way it was done? We are not a free people. We are not a constitutional republic anymore if this is allowed to stand. Even if you think it's a good idea. The deception, the lying, the baiting and switching, the false premises, the threats, the bullying, the blackmail and the intimidation, all done by people largely off the grid. Who is Bill Gates to be bragging about stimulus money going into the Department of Education? Who is David Coleman to tell you that your teachers, none of them will ever be able to teach anything other than what we tell them to? Who is he to do that? Oh, it's a simple matter now to point out the flaws and deficiencies of the standards. I got to give you one tiny little last history lesson, then I'll stop. But this is the big one, because I think accountability and transparency matter. I'm trying to be transparent here by showing you where I'm getting all my information and giving it to you. But they haven't been. The Common Core people did something you might be tempted to think was a good idea. After the standards were finally written, they convened a committee. They brought in 29 people from across the country, came to Washington, D.C. They called this committee the Validation Committee. And the Common Core paid them to evaluate the Common Core standards. They gave this committee absolute carte blanche. That committee could throw the standards out, could rewrite them, could validate them, say they're great. The interesting thing about the Validation Committee is they only brought in one math specialist and one English specialist. That was it. Only one mathematician who had any experience writing standards, and only one professor of English who had any experience with this. And you know she's a native daughter, Dr. Sandy Stotsky from Massachusetts. She lives here, and she was a professor for a long time down at the University of Arkansas. She was one of the major players that wrote the Massachusetts standards, which were so good relatively. So Dr. Stotsky, the only English professor with any standard writing experience, she said about Common Core, and I quote, "Get rid of them. These standards in English writing and comprehension are going to set our kids 3 years behind the 3 years they're already behind the rest of the world, the high-achieving nations of the world. Get rid of them." The math professor, if you can believe it, is even more impressive. He's a retired Stanford University math professor by the name of James Milgram. And most of the math that was done to get us to the moon in the 1960s, he did it as a young man. Most of those calculations were his. He was the only math expert brought in, the only person with standards experience. And he said, and I quote, "It is an absolute joke to think that Common Core math will prepare your kids for college-level math or for STEM careers. Careers in science, technology, engineering, and math. You know, those unimportant subjects. It's a joke," he said. "Get rid of them immediately." Milgram and Stotsky convinced a bunch of other people on that committee to vote no. You know what the Common Core did? They just cut them out of the final document. They just erased them and their objections from the final report and validated anyway. That's why Sandy is traveling the country. We've had her to Wisconsin 4 times. She testified before our legislature. She's been all over the country like I have doing this. That's why Professor Milgram is traveling the country warning people about this. Transparency. The people Common Core hired said it's a disaster, many of them. And they were not listened to, they were merely erased. And that's a fact. and ask that, you can go type in Stotsky's name into Google. You'll hear her tell you 1,000 different websites, right? Well, she's been all over the place. So this comes directly from Sandy, and it makes sense to me as an English professor. What's the problem with the English standards? Well, for starters, at every grade level in Common Core requires that kids do 50% more writing and 50% less reading than ever before. And we all know, everybody knows, that kids only learn how to write well after they have to learn how to read well. And as Sandy rightly points out, if they're really not reading much, what in the world are they writing about? Maybe that's how assignments like the one in Wisconsin a couple of years ago that went viral. Little eight-year-olds, little third graders, were sent home with an essay. Tell us how the state is just like the family, but better. That was the essay. As Sandy points out, this is absolute, and by the way, Sandy Stotsky and Jim Milgram are both lifelong Democrat voters. Even they are tinfoil hat wearing right now. But as Sandy points out, what you're setting up is a situation here where there is much, much more indoctrination going on in our schools. Another thing about Common Core is that at every grade level, Common Core mandates that 50% of the literature that kids used to read in English classes is pulled out, and it's replaced by so-called informational texts, many of which come directly from the federal government. Why do you read literature in English class? When you put your kids and grandkids to bed at night, you read them a bedtime story, don't you? I mean, the purpose is to get them to go to sleep. So if you want them to go to sleep at night, why don't you read them a Bill Gates computer manual? We'll do a better job. So you don't. You read them stories that get their little hearts pounding, their little eyelids fluttering. In other words, when you put them to bed, the stories are actually kind of wiring them up. But you do it because intrinsically you know that's how kids love to read stories. All that storytelling is being removed from Common Core, and it's being replaced with a lot of government propaganda. As Sandy says, when you read Shakespeare, who did write his plays, thank you, Hal. When you read Shakespeare, do you have any idea how Shakespeare would have voted on illegal immigration? When you read Jane Austen, do you have any idea how Jane Austen would have voted on green energy? Of course you don't. When you read the classics, you talk about big issues, truth, justice, love, war, peace, unpoliticized, right, theoretically. Well, now you're pulling that out, and you're replacing it with very tendentious, one-sided political propaganda, of which I will show you in a moment. So what do you got? Much less discussion of what you used to have in English class, discussion about character, ethics, morality, and much more indoctrination, much less classic literature, and much more informational texts like these. By the time your daughter's a freshman in high school, this is an English class, mind you. By the time your daughter's a freshman in high school, she's going to be reading things like this. Recommended levels of insulation. A report released in 2010 by the EPA and the Department of Energy. Read it? It's a 50-page, it's not a story, it's a 50-page regulatory document about the environmentally correct way to insulate new buildings. Is that something that's calculated to make your freshman daughter want to read more? Sandy rightly estimates that about 35% of the informational texts that are replacing literature in your kids' classroom all deal with man-made global warming and the undeniability of it and America's exclusive responsibility for it. That's it. Critical thinking, as Dr. Stotsky points out, is when you expose kids to multiple perspectives and you let them decide. They don't do that in Common Core. It's all one-sided all the time. By the time your son's in 10th grade, how about this little gem? They're going to be reading President Obama's own executive orders from the White House. Executive Order 13423, strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. How about a long essay on the evolution of the grocery bag? Spoiler alert, paper and plastic are both bad in America and destroying the planet. That little ditty of an article, by the way, it helped convince the California legislature to ban plastic bags across the state, which they did. No plastic bags in California. And many, many more like this, right? Why are your kids, even if you think it is the job of the schools to convince your kids of global warming, why are they doing this in English class? And what aren't you doing if you're doing this stuff, right? And then, as Sandy points out, of what little literature is actually left in Common Core, why did they pick the stuff they picked? Much of it is high. You heard the Washington Democrats, you heard the Chicago Teachers Union label Common Core developmentally inappropriate. One of the things they meant by that why in the world, of what little literature is left in Common Core, is so much of it so graphically sexual? Why is there so much quasi-pornography in the high school level? Why are there so many sexually inappropriate assignments for kids at younger grades? What's it doing there? One book in question is this one. This is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Morrison is a great writer. She's an African-American novelist. She's a Nobel Prize winner. But we would not assign this book to freshmen in college. It's all about a 12-year-old girl who's a victim of rape and incest. And in the course of the book, she comes to bond with her rapist, and she writes in shockingly graphic terms about the nature of the sexual encounters. This book has been pulled out of Common Core classrooms for kids as young as middle school, 8th grade. This book has been pulled out of Common Core classrooms for Catholic students as young as 8th grade, middle school. I blocked out the bad words. You may not be able to see it all that well, but you can get a sense, I think, from this, of the kind of stuff that's in this book. There are over 36 books like this, books like Black Swan, books like Dreaming in Cuban, that have startlingly graphic sexuality almost on every page. Why, as Dr. Stotsky points out, if you're going to take out all the literature, why do you put this stuff in its place? So between the government propaganda and the radical sexualization of what kids are reading, right, what is the purpose of these English standards? And it's not just the high school kids. Here's a typical Common Core assignment for an 8-year-old, a 3rd grader. Notice that Mom crossed it out. You got moms, have you noticed this? Moms all across the country are sending back homework assignments saying, I'm not telling my kids those things. Mom crossed it out and she wrote, inappropriate. I'm not explaining this to an 8-year-old. Let me read the paragraph. You know, it's a typical English assignment. Send the kids home with a paragraph or a page and have them read it and then answer some questions. What is the main theme of the paragraph? Who are the main characters? Okay, great. Perfectly acceptable assignment. Now listen to the paragraph that Common Core sent home to the 8-year-olds. Ruby sat on the bed she shared with her husband, holding a hair clip. There was something mysterious and powerful about the cheaply manufactured neon hair clip that she was fondling in her newly suspicious palms. She didn't recognize the hair clip. It was too big to be their daughter's, and Ruby was sure it wasn't hers. She hadn't had friends over in weeks, but here was this hair clip, little and green, with a few long black hair strands caught in it. Ruby ran her fingers through her own blonde hair. She had just been vacuuming when she noticed the small, bright green object under the bed. Now their life would never be the same. She would wait here until her husband Mike came home. And of course, to get the right answer, the astute 8-year-old has to conclude that Dad's having an adulterous affair in Mom's bed. That's why Mom crossed it out and sent it home. So even for the way the math questions are staged involve, and I'll show you some of those in a moment, highly sexualized situations. What do they do? There's an obvious answer for this. Are you ready to hear it? You want to wait? The obvious answer to this is one of the ways you pull kids away from their parents. One of the ways you break kids down, particularly from the Judeo-Christian morality they get in the home. One of the ways you undercut that so you can make them better citizens of the state is to sexualize them at young ages. Shockingly and frankly, as a way of breaking down the morality moms are trying to instill, because then you can reinscribe them. And so what? Let's talk about the math for a moment. We're going to come back and double back around. So I'm talking to Jim. We had Milgram come to Wisconsin too. Talking to a good professor about Common Core math. And he's bemused by it. He's convinced it's an absolute failure. It's not just a failure, it's dangerous. In asking him what his major concerns about Common Core math were, he said, well, first of all, it's a lie that it's ever been tested. First thing I did when I got to the committee, he said, is, okay, you say you benchmark this. Show me the math. And the whole time he was on that committee, they never provided. In fact, 6 years into Common Core, no one has ever seen any evidence that any real scientific analysis was ever done on this. It's all just a sham. That was his first problem. Second problem, he says, is that Common Core is designed. Its main idea is not to teach your kids math at a high level. What he calls it is social justice math. And what does he mean by that? Think about your own days in school. What percentage of kids in any given math class could really, really intuitively get math? 10%, 15% maybe? And the higher you go,